what is common in these two scenarios is that we have this change in the identities of the species that exist in any one place. And so, like, if I have one hobby horse, is that we should, what I said about, every time we talk about biodiversity, we say the loss is the word that follows it. It should be change.
Welcome to the Case for Conservation podcast, where we explore biodiversity conservation and the environment more broadly and interrogate conventional wisdom for the sake of a more robust case for conservation. I'm your host, Andre Mada. The concept of biodiversity loss is absolutely integral to conservation, and I've never met anyone who's seriously challenged the idea that too many species are going extinct, nor that their extinction is the result of human pressures. So what do we make of multiple studies telling us that we shouldn't be focusing so much on biodiversity loss? These studies say that, on average, in samples across the world, roughly equal numbers of sites are increasing in species richness and decreasing. Maria Dornelas is the ecologist from the University of Lisbon and the University of St. Andrews at the center of this research, and she joins me to elaborate. It should be mentioned right from the start that Maria is not suggesting that biodiversity loss is not a problem, but she explains why she thinks we are doing conservation a disservice by focusing on it the way that we do. Maria emphasized the importance of nuance in conversations about conservation, and this discussion is an illustration of the importance of avoiding too much generalization and simplification. Incidentally, there's a great new conservation podcast from the German Center for Integrative Biodiversity Research, IDIV, called Inside Biodiversity, which interviewed Maria recently and also interviewed Andrew Gonzalez, who poses some of the counter-arguments. I've tried to encapsulate those counter-arguments in my questions, but if you're interested in more, I suggest trying Inside Biodiversity. Volker Hahn is also a great podcast host who asks the kind of insightful questions that I find quite rare in conservation podcasts. Anyway, back on this episode of the Case for Conservation podcast, I began by asking Maria to summarize the current mainstream narrative around biodiversity loss and how she ended up challenging it.
Almost always when you hear the word biodiversity, it is followed by the word loss. It's almost like, the two come together, and we've come to think of biodiversity as something that is simultaneously precious, but also something that we are losing. And we hear lots of worrying numbers about the loss of wildlife and the extinction threats and elevated extinction rates. That was probably me as well. I was part of that narrative probably 10 years ago. And then in a project led by Anne McGurran, which aimed to look at temporal change in biodiversity. But the thing about temporal change is that it takes time to accumulate time series. And I was the postdoc in charge of analyzing the data, and the data wasn't going to be ready until the end of the project, right? Because we were collecting the time series. And so we thought, okay, let's see what other data is available out there. And it turns out that a lot of data was available. And so we accidentally started accumulating collections of time series. And when we started analyzing them, we realized that contrary to what we were expecting, actually, we were seeing a lot of cases where we didn't see any evidence of loss of biodiversity. We saw a balanced mix of increases and decreases in the numbers of species and their abundances. We did see, however, is really, really prevalent change in the composition of species. So what species you find in any particular place seems to be changing pretty much everywhere. And I think in hindsight, and having spent the last decade actually looking at the data in a lot of detail and so trying to sort of tease apart the details, I think what's happened is the narrative of loss comes from probably a warranted focus on the negative, where the problems are, and not enough focus on the positives. And both are happening because biodiversity is much more complex than we give it credit for, and there's a lot of it. Despite everything, there is actually a lot of many species on the planet. It's a big place, and it's a lot less understood than I appreciated before I started delving into the quantification of biodiversity change. It felt to me like it was a given. Like we know, biodiversity is being lost everywhere. No.
Mm-hmm.
Once you start looking carefully, that is not the case.
And so these time series, just to kind of see that a little bit more clearly, these are studies that have been done all over the world over different periods of time and at different scales. Is that correct? I mean, how localized are they, and over what periods of time, and also how far back do they go?
Okay, so the database that we have since created, so we started out haphazardly seeing what data we could find, and then quickly it became a question of we have to have criteria as to what constitutes a biodiversity time series. And so we came up with a list of criteria and we assembled a database. It's called Biotime. It's still running and it keeps growing. Turns out that there is much more data to be collated. The main hurdle actually is that standardization and curation is a big task, and so it's a people power issue more than a data availability issue.
Hmm.
So, what is the biodiversity time series? So the criteria that we came up with was it has to be a place that's been visited at least twice. Otherwise, the time access is not there. Because we are very worried about seasons, those two times need to be at least in 2 years. So this is the bare minimum. Evidently, this is not the goal, it's the bare minimum. So if it doesn't meet this criteria, we're not interested. In those visits, the methodology that is used to quantify biodiversity has to be the same because our estimates of biodiversity are incredibly sensitive to the method that we use to estimate it. And because we're interested in quantifying metrics like species richness and diversity and relative abundance distributions, things like dominance, etc., we wanted data sets where an entire assemblage is being quantified. So all of the species that belong to that particular assemblage, say, for example, all of the birds or all of the trees or all of the butterflies are counted and identified as species. And the counted sometimes is actually biomass in terms of instead of numbers of individuals, because for some species, it's not actually possible to separate individuals. Say grasses, for example, you can't do that. You can't count all of the stems. It doesn't work like that. So whatever metric of abundance is relevant to the organisms that we're studying, but the main point being that we want all of the organisms that belong to that group. And this is really important because of what I said earlier in terms of keeping track of the increases as well as the decreases. And I think that's partly where some of the discrepancies are coming in, is because we're not focused on populations, we're focused on assemblages. We're also counting the things that weren't there at the start, have appeared at some point, and have maybe or maybe not started increasing. So these are the three main criteria that we use. Then there's a fourth criteria, which is that actually things are identified mostly to species. And I say most of the species because, and this is again something I didn't appreciate, despite the fact that I do field work and I study corals in the field, and I know that a lot of the corals are just not described to like taxonomy hasn't caught up. So the number of species that are unknown to science is actually quite staggering. So I think around 2 million species are currently accepted as valid species. Estimates as to how many species exist on the planet range from about 9 million to billions. And so we really don't know. It's like the level of ignorance that we're at is really quite staggering when we think about it, when we start actually putting names on this.
Yeah.
So it's no wonder that there's so much uncertainty around these things.
And to what extent are you looking at populations as well, or is this really about species? And just for those few who may not be aware of the differences, population is just basically the number of individuals of a particular species in a particular space.
We are absolutely working with populations, not species, because we're not sort of keeping track of all of the possible populations. So a species will exist in lots of different places around the world. If it's an endemic, okay, that will be a smaller number of places, but it still will be more than one place. And typically we will, like our sample will be like one location. So the other thing that I think is maybe we appreciate now is this issue of scale. So changes at local scales and changes at a global scale can even go in opposite directions. You could have, like, there are scenarios where you could be, like, on a global scale, be reducing the number of species, but on a local scale, be increasing the number of species if you end up with the same species everywhere, for example. Because there are so many, so many individuals and so many species on the planet, there's lots of possible combinations happening. So working on with populations at the local scale, you can extract population level data from assemblage samples, but you can't do the opposite. So you can't estimate species richness if you've been keeping track of populations because you don't know what other populations were there to begin with.
Okay, and that actually brings me quite neatly to maybe the main question or my main question of the whole discussion, which is this idea of increase at the local level while globally number of species might be decreasing. So the main question is how can that be? But I think you've made that clear now. It's this idea of homogenization at a global scale when maybe the same species are present in different locations. So you might have a large number, but there might be the same ones that are repeated over space. Isn't that as much of a concern as the loss of species? Because it also kind of overlaps the idea of invasive species, right? Like the species that do homogenize tend to be those that are invasive and very often alien invasive, so from other parts of the world.
Yes, homogenization is a thing, and it is happening in some places, but it's not happening everywhere either. So we've actually looked at that and looked at for some data sets where the same methodology has been used in lots of different locations. You can look at not just how the identities of the species have changed in that particular location, but how the difference in composition has changed in different places included in that study. And you can ask, okay, have these places become more similar through time or more different? So do we have homogenization, so more similar, or do you have differentiation, more different? And rather annoyingly, there is almost a balance in the places that are becoming more similar versus the ones that are becoming more different. There is slightly more homogenization than differentiation, but both occur. And so taking a step back and thinking, okay, yes, invasive species, it's an issue. It is, humans have been moving species around and sometimes on purpose and sometimes accidentally releasing species in places where they didn't exist before. And if it's the same species that we introduce everywhere, then you end up with, I guess, a more boring world, for lack of a better word, because you see the same species everywhere, and it's an issue. In some cases, that can lead to losses if the species we introduce replace the ones that were there before, and if those were unique. So things like endemic species that have very small ranges that don't exist in very many places. In some cases, that can happen. But there are other things that we do that actually do the opposite. So we can, for example, change habitats so that instead of having sort of continuous habitats of a particular type, we break them up into different types of habitats. That would lead to differentiation, not homogenization.
Mm.
So, and we've been doing both. So, rather annoyingly, yes, homogenization is happening sometimes in some places, but so is differentiation. What is common in these two scenarios is that we have this change in the identities of the species that exist in any one place. And so, like, if I have one hobby horse, is that we should, what I said about, every time we talk about biodiversity, we say the loss is the
Hmm.
word that follows it. It should be change. Biodiversity change, I am like on board, is happening everywhere.
Hmm. But okay, so you're saying that not only is the roughly speaking, the number of locations where number of species is increasing about the same as where they're decreasing, but also the number of sites where homogenization is increasing is about the same as the number where differentiation is increasing. And then you also mentioned that fragmentation actually has the positive effect of diversifying habitats and therefore possibly increasing the number of species in a given area, I suppose.
um, One thing that I would say is that so I'm a macroecologist and so I'm not a conservation biologist. And so I don't know that I say something is negative or positive. So
Mm-hmm.
that is kind of beyond my area of expertise. I could tell you what the imperfect data that we have shows, whether that is positive or whether that is negative, is sort of like, I can tell you my opinion, but that's not my kind of scientific expertise,
Mm-hmm.
because that's about, I feel, values more than it is about ecology or the macroecological questions.
Yeah.
Uh,
But well, I mean, that's what ecologists should be doing, right? They should be kind of collecting and presenting the data, and then it's up to conservationists and I guess others as well to decide how to use that and, to apply it to management and to policy. So that's really, yeah, this is kind of a side discussion, but one of the areas in which I think nuance is sort of disappearing is how, well, I don't know if that's the way to put it, but the way that so many researchers feel that it's part of their duty, whether they're a conservation biologist or an ecologist, part of their duty to interpret and, sort of give the conclusions about what this means. And also in the literature, there's more and more pressure on authors to kind of give their recommendations that come out of the study, right? Whereas what they're doing is pure ecology. It should be a lot purer.
Yeah. So, look, I have a lot of respect for the people who work at the interface between science and policy. Is a very difficult thing to do.
Hmm.
It involves, like any interface, it involves navigating two different vocabularies and two different cultures and traditions. But one of my like a thing that really annoys me is like when papers say, oh, and this is really relevant for management or for conservation, but they don't actually tell us why or how. It's like, come on. It's like if you're gonna do that, this is really important stuff. If you're gonna do it seriously, right? So tell us exactly how the practice should change because of this evidence that you found.
Hmm.
And not all that ecologists do is relevant for conservation.
Hmm.
And that's also okay, because sometimes things that we do, we didn't plan for them to be relevant, but they actually change almost accidentally. There's this accidental science thing that I think is really important to preserve. But so my imposter syndrome really rears its head whenever I kind of feel myself pushed too hard towards the advocacy or the policy side, because that is like, I don't study policy. I study biological assemblages. I study biodiversity, and I can tell you what the data says. I can tell you, I can discuss with you the advantages and disadvantages of different metrics and how imperfect the data is. All of that I can do, and I feel like I'm within the realms of my expertise.
Mm.
But, I feel like I need to be humble and realize that I don't actually know very well how that translates into change in policy, because I think that takes.
Yeah. I think that, I heard something about this the other day that I think is outside of our field, but there's this phenomenon by which the more you know about something, the more dangerously confident you are in making recommendations based on that. And so even the most expert doesn't know everything, but the more they know, the more confident they are that what they know is everything. And when that translates to policy, it can be a bit of an issue. And I think just again, this idea of this sort of pressure to provide recommendations. I hear what you're saying about, if you're going to provide recommendations and say what they are exactly and how to achieve them. But I do think that the pressure to simply provide them in the first place, especially in ecology. I mean, in conservation, you can understand it because conservation is about management and policy to some extent. But in the case of ecology, sometimes yes, but I would say most of the time, probably no. It just can provide sort of a false sense of knowledge, I guess. But just to kind of take us back a little bit to the core of the discussion, and just back to this question of how it can be that biodiversity is being lost at the global scale, or maybe, and yet not at the local scale, cumulatively. So if you've got sort of roughly equal numbers of sites increasing in species richness and decreasing, you've got roughly an equal number of sites that are increasing in homogeneity and in diversification. And then you've got mechanisms like fragmentation that are making that happen. I mean, just theoretically speaking, considering that species take thousands or hundreds of thousands of years to be created, What is your kind of theory of whether biodiversity is increasing or decreasing at the global level? And I know you haven't studied this in particular, but just sort of considering all these different mechanisms that are at work, because it's sort of, you would think that because of our impact on the planet and the amount of habitat that we've changed and the negative effects of fragmentation, you would think that overall that must be losing as species in the long run.
So I have, I think, three answers to that question, or three. It's a 3 points. So first of all, I think that our uncertainty about what is happening at the global scale is by necessity the highest because it's the hardest to estimate. We have no clue really how many species there are on the planet.
Hmm.
Estimating extinction rates is incredibly difficult because the rarer a species becomes, the harder it is to estimate with certainty their abundance. So that's point number one. It's a very difficult thing to do. To the best of our knowledge, extinction rates at the moment are much higher than baseline extinction rates. And
Hmm.
that is worrying because extinction is forever, like you said. And for a human caused mass extinction would be a disaster. We know that previous mass extinctions were times of incredible upheaval in the whole planet. And it's not just the species themselves, but it's everything that they do to the planet that is at risk.
Hmm.
There, it's not like a hiccup kind of thing. It's a really serious issue. So that's part of the answer. There's a lot of uncertainty, but as far as we know, yes, extinction rates are elevated, and that is very concerning. Second part of the answer is timescales. A mass extinction, which is, I think, the main thing that we worry about when we talk about elevated extinction rates, corresponds to about 75% of the species going extinct in a relatively short amount of time. And by relatively short amount of time, we're talking geologic time, so 2 million years.
Hmm.
Our best estimates of current extinction rates are so high that we're not talking 2 million years. We're probably talking a few thousand years, but it's still a few thousand years. Okay, so time scale. So we would need to keep the current extinction rates at their current rates for a few thousand years, potentially tens of thousands of years, to actually have produced a mass extinction. So mass extinction, we definitely don't want it, but it's not too late to stop it,
Hmm.
is my second point. Timescales really, really matter. The third point of my answer,
And sorry, at the
yes.
risk of derailing your, I just wanted to ask,
Yeah.
so when people think about species, they think mostly about vertebrates, maybe mostly about mammals and birds. So I just wanted to ask what you're saying. Do you think that applies to vertebrates as well as species in general? Do you think that the rate of that 75% that you're talking about, does that apply to vertebrates as well, more or less?
The answer is we don't know. We know a lot more about vertebrates, like about vertebrate taxonomy, how many vertebrate species there are in total, and we know a lot more about how endangered they are than we know about any other group of organisms on this planet. So that's the first. So we don't know
Hmm.
is the like I feel the honest state of the field. We can make extrapolations, and I do like I am not afraid to make extrapolations. I think it's important, and this is how science actually progresses. We go out, we give our best guess, and then we're prepared to be wrong. So somebody's going to come along, maybe us, maybe somebody else is going to come along and give a better guess, and this is how science progresses. So I don't think it's wrong to make those extrapolations, and when we do that, and it's probably sensible to actually think about worst case scenario in case it plays out. So I don't think it's completely unreasonable to do that, but without losing sight of the fact that this is what we really know, and this is what, and this part is our best guess. So I think humility is really key here so that we don't kind of in the process make the logical leap from threatened to extinct. Because threatened means, oh, do something, stop this, don't let it happen. Extinct means it's too late. We've lost. And in between these two, there is a world of things that can happen and have been
And
happening,
have been happening,
right?
right? So a lot of good work has been happening to bring species back from the brink.
Exactly. Like even a couple of weeks ago, there was a paper which I've only glanced at about tigers bouncing back in India, which is amazing to hear about, right? So like not that long ago, like I think people were pretty much resigned to tigers only existing in zoos because what else could happen? Human populations are exploding in India. How could we possibly have both? But hang on, we do.
Mhm.
So I feel like it's really important not to limit our imaginations to the worst case scenario. I think it's important that we consider it, but then also don't take that as the truth. Take that as what could be the truth if nothing is done.
Right. Yeah, sorry for that diversion, but I think it was an interesting one. But you had another point to add to your
Right.
list of 3 points.
Yeah, my third point about local and extinction, because you said something about habitat destruction. And with the risk of being controversial, I actually think habitat destruction is a misnomer. The planet doesn't shrink, right? So, like when we destroy a habitat, we actually replace that ecosystem with a different ecosystem. And a lot of the time, other species are going to like it. It may not be the species that we care about. It may not be the species that we want and feel are important to protect. But actually, we never destroy a habitat. We never fully destroy an ecosystem. We replace it with something else. So, for example, we at the moment hear a lot about big bird declines. Some of these bird declines are actually farmland birds. That have exploded in their populations because they do really well in habitats that we create with our farms. So that's also precious habitat. And if our farms become either become abandoned, become reforested or whatever, or become more hostile towards these organisms, these birds suffer, right? Their populations decline. And so I feel like it's important to realize that even things like deforestation, they're not bad for all of the species. Some species actually thrive when we cut down a forest. I'm not arguing we should be cutting down forests. I'm just saying, like, the numbers say, you'll have more grasses if you cut down trees. So it's complicated. There isn't it's not as simple as we've actually detonated a nuclear bomb and everything, all life has disappeared. Although think of Chernobyl and how wildlife is actually thriving in the aftermath of a nuclear explosion. Is I feel like we keep underestimating the natural world and how it can bounce back.
And what about the difference between the very biodiverse parts of the world, which tend to be the less not the less populated, but the less developed parts of the world, compared to the opposite. So thinking about Europe, where you're based, compared to Brazil or South Africa or Indonesia, the change, and thinking especially about the change in habitat in these places, a change in habitat in Europe, at least logically, you would think that would have a much smaller effect than a change in habitat in one of these much more biodiverse places. And I know you haven't studied that specifically, but would you imagine, and maybe your time series have given some indication of whether it differs, between those two extremes?
So we have a lot more data from, well, Europe, North America, and Australasia than we do from anywhere else. So one of the issues, like one of the caveats that I would say about all of what I've said is that the data that we have available is imperfect. We have lots of blind spots, and it is possible that because we don't have loss everywhere, we have loss in some places and gains in other places. Actually, having representative data is really important to have an accurate understanding of how, as a whole, the planet's biodiversity is changing. So that's the first point. And I don't know is the honest answer. So the tropics in general tend to harbor more species than and then there's something called the latitudinal gradient of diversity. So the number of species tends to decline as you go from the equator towards the poles.
Hmm.
And so if you only cared about the numbers of species and didn't really care about who they were, you'd probably say let's just focus on the tropics and forget about everywhere else. Now, evidently, that would leave out polar species, which in the middle of climate change are possibly, the ones that are running out of places to be, right? So, so the planet is warming. So not something that I think we should do, and why I think it's really important that we focus on the identities of the species as well as just sheer numbers of individuals or sheer numbers of species. I think it's really important to focus on both. We have looked at, or we've tried to look at, to see if we see a pattern in terms of are the tropics on average losing species, and actually could potentially the temperate regions be gaining species? We see a little bit of a hint of that, which is actually what you would expect under a scenario where the planet is warming, because species tend to be expanding their ranges towards the poles as the planet warms. We see a little bit of that in the marine realm, which is much more connected, less so in the terrestrial realm. We don't really detect it in the terrestrial realm. What is the balance? The honest answer to that is we need more representative data to be able to say with certainty.
Right. This is a small point, but just interesting that you've noticed more of that kind of migration in the marine realm than in the terrestrial realm. Because, I mean, isn't it true that the marine realm is generally more constant and fluctuations are less severe than on land? I would have thought it would be the other way around.
Oh, no, the marine realm fluctuates wildly,
Okay.
but including in temperature. I think part of our idea of that comes from the fact that we are terrestrial organisms, not marine ones.
Yeah, yeah.
So once we actually start measuring, we see that the marine realm actually varies a lot.
Okay.
I think it is less about temperature variation, and it's more about actually connectivity. So the fact
Right.
that
It's easier to move,
many marine,
basically.
yeah, it's easy to move. It's more connected in general. Marine species, even animals, not just plants, have like a seed-like life stage that is like largely for dispersive reasons.
A related question would be about alpha biodiversity or alpha diversity versus beta and gamma diversity. And if I remember correctly, alpha biodiversity would be the diversity in a given area, sort of in a plot, which might be sort of meter by a meter, or it could be 10 by 10 or 100 by 100 or whatever it is. And then beta diversity would be along a transect. So how much diversity changes as you go along a straight line, from one point to another. And then gamma diversity, this memory is even more hazy, but I think that's sort of same as beta diversity, except that you're moving across gradients, across sort of ecological gradients, sort of up and down a hill or something like that. I might be already getting things wrong, but I'm just wondering, my question would be, your time series, to what extent do they cover these different kinds of diversity, or are they all looking at alpha biodiversity? Because, if you are also looking at beta and gamma diversity, then you're likely to get a better idea of, this homogenization versus diversification issue, I guess.
So another way of thinking about alpha, beta, gamma is the scale. So alpha being the local scale and gamma being the global scale, and beta actually being the thing that connects them. So if you have lots of alphas and they are slightly different or more different, that affects how the sum of the alphas builds onto the gamma, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Hence the transect that you were mentioning. We do look at alpha, beta, and gamma diversity, and the homogenization differentiation answer that I gave earlier relates to that, and the discussions that we've had about how change in diversity can be different at different spatial scales is exactly about this change, this tension between change at a local scale and change at larger scales, because gamma is not one particular scale. When assembling the data within biotime, we focus on actually getting the raw data rather than just the diversity metric estimates. We can then use the estimates of species abundances to calculate, by pooling data at different scales, we can use it to calculate these different types of diversity, different metrics of diversity. There isn't a single biodiversity metric to rule them all. It just doesn't work like that. It's too complex, and different metrics emphasize different things, and that is a good thing. because depending on why you're wanting to quantify biodiversity, you might want to particularly focus on rare species, for example, and species richness, which is a very famous metric, probably the most commonly used metric. It's just a count of how many species you have in a sample. That really emphasizes the rare species because most species are rare. Whereas, say, total abundance, how many individuals you found, really emphasizes the abundant species because the most abundant species are typically like orders of magnitude more abundant than the really rare species. So you need to look at both. It will tell you different things, right? So depending on exactly what your question is, what is the biodiversity metric that you want to use, whether you want to focus on the alpha, the beta, or the gamma angle, it's a complex and nuanced endeavor, I think.
Right. Just speaking about richness, biodiversity richness, the one critique that I've heard of some of the work that you and your colleagues have done seems to have been directed at the richness side of things. And if I understood the critique correctly, it was basically that you are focusing too much on richness and not on other aspects. But as you've explained now, and also earlier when we were talking about populations versus species, it sounds like your research is not limited to that. So can you sort of unpick that critique a little bit?
Yeah, it is fair to say that species richness is a limited biodiversity metric. Of course it is. Like all metrics are limited. It is unfair to say that that is the only metric that we have focused on. The very first paper that we published, we actually used something like, I think it was like 14 different biodiversity metrics, and the conclusions are robust to what metric we use. So this idea of balances in gains and losses, winners and losers, we see regardless of whether we look at species richness, whether we look at dominance, whether we look at total abundance, or whether we look at the population scale and actually sort of tally the populations that are increasing with the ones that are decreasing with the ones that are not changing at all. It's pretty constant. So that's not where the issue is. That is an easy to respond to critique.
Mm-hmm.
Other critiques that we've also faced are, I feel, fairer. So one is the issue of representativeness, which I've brought up before. So in your answer, like because we don't have loss everywhere, we have loss in some places and gains in other places. Having more representative data becomes really important because of the questions you were asking earlier about, what about the tropics? Like if most species are in the tropics and if all of your losses are in the tropics, then is this really a disaster and you're just not paying attention? We don't see evidence of that actually. So we do also see increases in the tropics. It is possible, and I cannot tell you with certainty, if the balance is towards losses in the tropics. I don't know. We don't have enough data from there. We also don't have enough data from polar regions, by the way, because most of our data comes from Europe, North America, and Australia. And then, there's the deep sea or the high seas in general, where nobody goes. And, the 70% of the planet is covered by salt water. The oceans are on average 4 kilometers deep. This is a really big chunk of the planet. So it's not even just the terrestrial realm either. So that's one of the things that I feel like is really important to point out. And so I really, really feel like we need to the best of our ability be reducing our blind spots so that we actually have a better answer to this question. Because it's not simple, because it's not just loss everywhere. Because even cutting down forests can lead to some things increasing.
Earlier on, you were talking about, I don't know if you mentioned ecosystem services in particular, but you were sort of hinting at the fact that, biodiversity change can mean the loss of ecosystem services. And I hope I'm not misinterpreting what you said. But that's not one of the metrics that you were looking at, right? The 12 or so metrics that you mentioned.
No.
Okay. So just then, hypothetically speaking, do you have any sense of whether biodiversity change, especially homogenization, but also diversification, and also just remaining the same but different assemblages of species, do you have any sense of whether biodiversity change may be negative or positive for ecosystem services? In other words, the ways in which we use that biodiversity and the ways in which it serves us as a species.
We have started making a little bit of progress towards it, but there's a lot left to be done there. One particular trait that we've looked at is so let me just take a step back and say, like, because we're working with any organism on a planet that we have reliable data to deal with, like one of the difficult things is to find, I guess, traits of the species that are common across everything, something that you can measure for a tree as well as a fish. One thing that we have looked at, which is common to all the organisms, is body size. So we've looked at whether we see any evidence of shifts in body size. And our hypothesis when we set out was that we have reasons to believe that we should be seeing a decrease of body size on average. And when we define that, so we tend to cut down the biggest trees. And if we plant out trees, it would take centuries before they have reached those super big sizes. When we fish, we tend to take out the bigger fish first. And well, you can have even higher numbers of fish, but if they're smaller, they will have sort of different implications for ecosystem function and consequently for ecosystem services as well. So the focus on change rather than loss allows us to then sort of really dig in and say, okay, what does this mean? Because we don't care about all species in the same way. So some of them we care. So the amount of carbon a big tree sequesters is very different from the amount of carbon a tree sapling sequesters. They're both trees, but they're not equivalent, right? So they're really quite different. And the amount of people that big fish feeds is very different from the amount of people that small fish feeds. And so again, it really matters. The detail really matters here. And I think this is an active area of investigation that needs a lot more unpicking. What are the implications? And then because we see shifts in, again, complex, not everything is getting smaller, right? So some of the complicated feedbacks that happen is like once you remove really big things that were not so big before, have the space to become bigger. So none of this is simple. It's not a simple case of that, you just remove one bit and then everything else that is doesn't change. Everything changes. Every time you change an ecosystem, it kind of pulls all kinds of strings that some of which we're not even aware of. But we do see evidence of shift towards smaller body sizes, mostly in marine communities, mostly associated to fish is where we see the signal more strongly, but also elsewhere and on average. And then this is likely to have implications for everything, because even an organism metabolic rate is driven by its size. Like it's one of the best predictors of how much energy it uses and produces. So it fundamentally changes the pace of life once you've changed the body size of organisms.
Right. It doesn't just affect the composition, but also the function of the system, right?
Yes.
But are you talking about sort of change in species composition or more, or are you talking more about within species or both? I guess both, right?
Both.
Okay.
And again, you can have complex feedbacks happening there, right? And depending on the assemblage, so within fish assemblages in particular, which are a big part of the data that kind of supports this pattern, mostly so big fish eat smaller fish regardless of the species, and so you have like the trophic implications of the shift in body size are really significant, even if we ignore for a second species identities. And we see evidence of both. So within species, we see evidence of the average size of the species decreasing, but also the replacement of bigger species by smaller species. Again, not everywhere, but on average, we see a signal of that.
I was wondering about typical examples of what you find in these time series, because, my kind of ingrained idea of massive habitat change is, I'm from South Africa. It's a very biodiverse country, and we used to go snake collecting in the countryside. And I remember the gradient from the sort of natural vegetation to the areas that have been overtaken by Australian acacia species. So this is a very specific example, but it's repeated in many different ways in different parts of the world. But that transition was sort of from this, you'd look around in the fynbos, the natural vegetation, you'd see literally 100 species of just plants, and then the animals associated with them. Then you'd go into the acacia thicket, and it was literally a single species with nothing growing underneath it. And this really sterile environment and, just had a completely different feel about it. And so I think my thinking has been quite deeply affected by that kind of experience and that contrast. It's sort of it really felt like a loss of quality had happened there. So, and I know that you're looking at hundreds of different, thousands of data sets, but what is kind of typical? I mean, in most of the cases where a lot of change has happened, has it been this kind of degrading kind of change, or what is? If you could maybe just sort of sketch a couple of the examples of what you see, maybe that would be the best way to answer that.
I don't know that we can see that from the types of analysis that we do,
Hmm.
because we're aiming for generality, and so we're not really looking at the detail of that. Just anecdotally, it's really interesting. Like you mentioned the Australian acacias. I did my PhD in Australia, but I grew up in Portugal, and so I grew up with a hate of eucalyptus trees because they're the horrible trees that people plant everywhere, and there's this really fire-prone forest instead of our oak forests.
Hmm.
And then I moved to Australia, and you have these beautiful eucalyptus forests, and eucalyptus are not evil, okay, which is
Yeah.
they're just plants doing their
Hmm.
thing.
Yeah, it's all the case of where. But yeah, but I was just kind of curious, sort of to what extent, and I know I'm harping on about invasive species, but I'm curious to what extent invasive species, whether they're alien invasives or just range expanders, how much of a role they're playing in this species turnover that you've observed.
Um, for sure, some of the role. I think we probably detect more range expansions than we do introductions, largely because
Hmm.
of the timeline. So the data that we have in biotime, I mean, it stretches back to the 1800s, but really the overwhelming majority is from the past 50 years or so. And a lot of these introductions are much older than that. And then also bear in mind, like I said, like most of the data that we have is from Europe and North America and Australia. And the bulk of the habitat transfer in Europe in particular is a lot older than that, right? It didn't happen in the past 50 years. We've fundamentally modified the landscape in Europe in particular hundreds, if not thousands of years ago. So that's the other sort of element of the time scale that I think is important to bear in mind. I guess like the main thing that I've learned from this is that both spatial and temporal scales really matter for what patterns you see. And also because of that, and because we can't travel in time, it's really important that we document what is going on very carefully with as few blind spots as possible, because we'll be collecting now the monitoring data for the future. It's a little bit like planting trees, right? The best time to do it was like 10 years ago. The second best time is now.
Hmm. One last question is, how do you think we deal with the general tendency of the conservation community, let's say, to use, maybe it's too strong a word, but doomsaying as a way to sort of sway public opinion? And so the reason I bring this up now to kind of tie up the conversation is that the biodiversity loss narrative that you spoke about right from the beginning is pretty pervasive, right? And people in our field sort of have context to digest that kind of message. People outside our field rely on the experts to tell them, how bad things are. And a concern of mine that I've repeated many times on this podcast is that we rely too much on the doom saying to get results, to get funding, to get interest, to get votes, all the rest of it. But if that turns out to be inaccurate or incorrect, even at local scales, that can really affect the credibility of conservation. So I've kind of given you my answer to that question, but I'd be curious about yours.
Well, I'm actually glad you asked me that question because that's also been one of the critiques that's been issued against us is how can you possibly say you don't detect biodiversity loss by saying that you're completely undermining the conservation movement? And, my first answer to that is that I don't think scientists should censor what the data say. I think we should be clear about the uncertainties, and I try very hard to do that, to be as transparent as I can in terms of the limitations of what I do and do not know. But what the data says is what the data says. To the best of our ability, we do it in a transparent way. Be prepared to be wrong if someone else comes along and does a better job. So this is like me being really quite defensive because it's something that I feel very strongly about. So the first answer to that is I feel like scientists should be brokers of truth, whatever the truth at the time is. So like our best guess, regardless of what that truth does to our preferred message. We shouldn't let our agendas drive what we publish. And then I do agree with you. I actually think being prophets of doom is counterproductive. I think there is huge fatigue of negative stories. I think it's important, like negative stories are important, but we shouldn't censor the positive stories, right? Which is like largely what is being done when I'm being told you're not allowed to say this because it undermines the conservation narrative. That is censorship, and that's not okay. And it's counterproductive. I think the conservation movement should be hugely proud of itself. It didn't exist that long ago, and it has achieved lots of really positive things. So I remember studying my undergraduate degree, and the Iberian lynx was, going to go extinct. Like, this is the mid 90s, and there was no way, like, there was only a handful of wild animals. It is, I mean, it's not out of the woods, but it's been increasing for decades now. And and that's a good thing. We should be proud of it. And there's lots of examples like that. And for some reason, we don't talk about those. It's like they're a dirty secret, and we have to keep saying everything is going down the drain. It's not. We should be proud of the good things that we do. Like we should also not take it for granted, right? So because we have species protection and water protection, and those things make things better, we're more likely to be able to keep them, right? If all we say is that everything is terrible, then why should we bother? It is an investment, and we're having to sacrifice other things to prioritize this. If it has paid, we should be transparent about it. We should be clear about it, and that should be part of our narrative as well. But this last bit was a rant of my own opinion, not my scientific expertise. Just to be clear, because I think it's important to kind of make the distinction to when I'm talking as a scientist versus when I'm giving you my opinion as a person.
Sure. And when you're sort of writing a scientific paper or maybe a popular article, and you're giving this news that, according to your findings, species are not necessarily decreasing wherever you look, do you think that it's appropriate and or necessary to accompany that with a message that, that doesn't mean we're out of the woods or we still need to be careful? Do you think that needs to be a part of the discussion, or is that up to the conservationists? You're an ecologist. Is that up to the conservationists and others to use your information and interpret it in that direction?
I think everything you say has the potential to be misconstrued, and so it is important that you try to decrease the chances that there is a scenario where, having found a balance of winners and losers, someone takes this and their own agenda is to kind of remove all the environmental regulations and say, but everything is fine, guys. So we can stop worrying now. And I don't want that, right? I don't think anyone wants that. Well, I don't think anyone in this who cares about conservation wants that. So I think it's important to try and prevent that from happening by being clear in terms of what we think these results mean.